Humans' Beggar was actually an alien, living among humans to seek a healthy man for mating. The marketplace of Amarillo bustled with life as the morning sun painted the cobblestones with golden light. Merchants shouted over one another, peddling their goods with practiced fervour, while townsfolk meandered from stall to stall, bartering for fresh produce and trinkets. Amid the lively scene, a beggar sat quietly near the edge of the square, her figure wrapped in a tattered grey cloak that concealed her face and body. Urena observed the humans with an intensity that went unnoticed by passers-by. Her amber eyes, dulled with dirt but still retaining a faint glow, studied their movements, their interactions, the way their faces lit up when they found a good deal or shared a laugh with a friend. It was all so familiar now, yet entirely alien to her true nature. She reached for the small cloth bundle beside her, unwrapping it to reveal the crust of bread given to her the previous day. As she nibbled at it, she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. These people had so little, yet they shared it with her without question. They saw only a beggar in need, not the being from another world hiding beneath the guise of poverty. Her mission was clear, yet it weighed heavily on her. She was here to find a human, a strong, healthy man to mate with, and ensure the survival of her species. It was a task of great importance, yet every act of kindness she received made her feel like an intruder, a thief stealing moments of humanity that weren't hers to claim. A shadow fell across her, breaking her thoughts. She looked up to see a man standing before her, tall and broad-shouldered. His sun-kissed skin and dark hair gleamed under the morning light, and his expression held a mix of curiosity and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. Urena nodded, pulling her cloak tighter around her. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to sell the illusion. The man crouched down, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "You've been here a while. I've seen you sitting in the same spot for weeks. Do you have somewhere to go?" She shook her head, unsure of how much to reveal. He sighed and reached into the satchel slung across his shoulder, pulling out a loaf of bread. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "It's not much, but it should help." Urena hesitated, her hand hovering over the offering. Accepting it felt wrong, like taking something she didn't deserve, but the rumble in her stomach reminded her that she needed sustenance, not just for herself, but for the mission she couldn't afford to fail. "Thank you," she murmured, taking the bread and cradling it in her hands as if it were a precious treasure. The man smiled, a warm, genuine expression that made her chest tighten. "My name's Devar," he said. "If you ever need help, I live just down the road on the farm past the hill." Urena watched as he stood and walked away, his figure blending into the crowd. She stared at the bread in her hands, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. Devar's name lingered in her mind, accompanied by the image of his kind eyes and strong frame. He was different from the others she had observed, different in a way that stirred something within her, something she hadn't felt since leaving Zera. She tore a piece of the bread and brought it to her lips, chewing slowly as her mind raced. This man could be the one. He had the physical strength her species required, but more than that, he had a kindness that set him apart. Yet the thought of deceiving him, of using him for her mission, filled her with unease. As the day turned to evening, Urena remained in the marketplace, her gaze drifting toward the path Devar had taken. She told herself it was for the mission, that she needed to observe him further to determine his suitability. But deep down, she knew there was more to it than that. The following morning, she made her way to the farm he had mentioned, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and fear. The journey was longer than she expected, the path winding through fields of tall grass that swayed gently in the breeze. When she finally reached the farmhouse, she paused, taking a moment to steady her nerves. The house was modest, but well maintained, with a small garden blooming with vibrant flowers. She approached the door and raised her hand to knock, but before she could, it swung open to reveal Devar, his expression shifting from surprise to recognition. "You came," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Urena nodded, clutching the edges of her cloak. I need work," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep living the way I have been." Devar stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Come in," he said. "We'll figure something out." As she stepped inside, the warmth of the farmhouse enveloped her, a stark contrast to the chill she had grown accustomed to. The walls were adorned with simple but meaningful decorations, photographs, paintings, and handmade crafts that spoke of a life rooted in hard work and community. Devar led her to the kitchen, where he set a kettle on the stove, tea offered, glancing over his shoulder. "Yes, please," she replied, her voice steadying as she took in her surroundings. He poured 2 cups and handed one to her before taking a seat at the wooden table. "So," he began, his tone light but curious, "what brings you to Amaryl?" Urena hesitated, her mind scrambling for a plausible answer. "I've been travelling," she said carefully, "looking for a place to settle down." Devar nodded, taking a sip of his tea. "Well, you're welcome to stay here for as long as you need. There's always work to be done on the farm, and I could use the help." Her eyes met his, and for a moment the weight of her mission faded, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or maybe hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying more emotion than she intended. The days that followed were filled with hard work and quiet moments of connection. Urena learned to tend to the crops, care for the animals, and navigate the rhythms of farm life. Devar was patient with her, teaching her everything she needed to know without judgment or frustration. In turn, she found herself drawn to him in ways she hadn't anticipated. His strength was evident in the way he carried heavy loads and worked tirelessly from dawn to dusk. But it was his kindness that captivated her. He had a way of making her feel seen, not as a beggar or an outsider, but as someone who belonged. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Devar turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You're different," he said softly. "There's something about you, something I can't quite put into words." Urena's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to tell him the truth, to reveal the secret she had carried since arriving on Earth, but fear held her back. The fear of rejection, of losing the fragile connection they had built. "Maybe it's because I see the world differently," she said finally, her voice tinged with sadness. "I've had to." Devar studied her for a moment, before nodding. "Well, whatever it is, I'm glad you're here." His words warmed her in a way she hadn't expected, filling the void of loneliness she had carried for so long. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Urena found herself daring to hope, for her mission, for her people, and for something she hadn't allowed herself to dream of. A future with Devar. The days on the farm stretched into weeks, and with each passing sunrise, Urena felt a peculiar warmth settle in her chest. She had come to Earth with a singular purpose, a mission that loomed over her every thought. Yet here, amidst the gentle rustling of leaves and the earthy scent of soil, she found herself entangled in a life that felt strangely fulfilling. Devar was at the heart of it. His unwavering kindness and strength drew her in, making her question everything she had known. Back on Zera, her people valued efficiency and duty above all else. Emotions were secondary, fleeting things to be controlled. But here, feelings seemed to flow freely, as natural as the rivers and as enduring as the mountains. One evening, after a long day of planting new crops, Urena stood by the edge of the field, watching Devar work. The golden light of the setting sun framed him in a glow that made him seem almost ethereal. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat, and his hands moved with practiced precision as he adjusted the irrigation system. "You've been staring a while," Devar said without turning, his voice tinged with amusement. Urena startled, heat rushing to her cheeks. "I was just admiring your technique," she replied hastily. He chuckled, straightening and turning to face her. "Well, you've been picking it up quickly. Pretty soon, you'll be running this farm better than I can." She smiled, the corners of her lips tugging upward in a way that felt unfamiliar, yet welcome. "I doubt that. This is your world, your way of life. I'm just learning." Devar walked closer, his gaze soft, yet probing. "And doing a damn good job of it," he said. "You're stronger than you think, Urena." His words hit her harder than she expected. Strength wasn't something she associated with herself, not in the way her people defined it. Strength meant resolve, a willingness to sacrifice, even at the cost of one's own desires. Yet Devar made her feel strong in a different way, as if her presence alone was enough to matter. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the farm fading into the background. Urena's heart raced, each beat echoing in her ears. She wanted to say more, to tell him the truth about who she was and why she had come. But the fear of breaking the fragile peace they had built kept her silent. Later that night, Urena found herself in the small room Devar had offered her when she first arrived. It was simple but cosy, with a bed that creaked when she moved and a window that overlooked the fields. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her thoughts were a tangle of conflicting emotions. She had grown to care for Devar in ways she hadn't anticipated. His presence filled a void she hadn't realized existed, and the idea of deceiving him felt like a betrayal, not just of him, but of herself. Yet her mission remained. Her people were counting on her to find a suitable mate to ensure the continuation of their species. Time was running out, and the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. The sound of footsteps outside her door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. A soft knock followed, and she rose to open it. Devar stood there, his expression unreadable. "I thought you might like some tea," he said, holding out a steaming cup. Urena accepted it with a small smile. "Thank you." He hesitated, then gestured toward the small table in the corner of the room. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" "Of course not," she said, stepping aside to let him in. They sat across from each other, the warm light of the oil lamp casting shadows on the walls. For a while they sipped their tea in silence, the quiet moments stretching comfortably between them. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Devar said finally, setting his cup down. Urena's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You're different," he said, his words measured. "I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just, there's something about you I can't quite figure out." Her chest tightened, and she forced herself to meet his gaze. "What do you mean?" Devar sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's hard to explain. You're so capable, so determined. But sometimes I catch this look in your eyes, like you're carrying a weight no one else can see." Urena looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "You're not wrong," she admitted. "There are things about me, about my past, that I haven't told you." Devar reached out, his hand covering hers. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share," he said gently. "But whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." His touch sent a jolt through her, a mix of comfort and fear. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he could handle the truth. But the risk was too great. "Thank you," she said softly, withdrawing her hand. "That means more to me than you know." The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken emotions. Devar's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'll let you get some rest," he said, his voice warm but tinged with a note of reluctance. Urena watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. She sat in the quiet of her room, her thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and longing. As the days turned into weeks, Urena found herself growing closer to Devar. Their bond deepened with each shared laugh, each moment of quiet understanding. Yet the shadow of her mission loomed ever larger, a constant reminder of the choice she would eventually have to make. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day of work, Devar turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, "I've never met anyone quite like you." Urena smiled, her heart aching with the weight of her secret. "You're not so bad yourself," she replied, her voice light but laced with sincerity. He chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "I mean it, though. You've brought something to this farm, to my life, that I didn't even realize was missing." Her breath caught and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Devar," she began, her voice trembling. He reached for her hand, his touch steady and grounding. "Whatever it is you're holding back, whatever is keeping you from letting me in, just know that I'm here whenever you're ready." Tears pricked at her eyes, and she bit her lip to keep them from falling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That night, as she lay in bed, Urena made a decision. She couldn't keep hiding the truth from Devar, not if she wanted to build something real with him. But how could she explain her mission, her true identity, without shattering the fragile trust they had built? The answer eluded her, and as sleep finally claimed her, her dreams were filled with images of Zera, of her people waiting for her return, and of Devar's face, kind and understanding, yet tinged with the pain of betrayal. The morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities. But for now, Urena allowed herself a moment of quiet, a brief respite from the storm brewing within her heart. Urena awoke before dawn, the soft glow of moonlight filtering through her window. Sleep had eluded her for most of the night, her thoughts an endless cycle of longing, guilt, and uncertainty. The farm had become more than a place to hide. It was a sanctuary, a world where she could pretend, if only for a moment, that she was just another person trying to carve out a life. But the pretense was growing thin. She dressed quietly, the soft fabric of her borrowed clothes brushing against her skin as she stepped. Out of her room, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath her feet reminded her of how far she was from the sleek, silent halls of her spacecraft. The air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-drenched earth and the faint aroma of hay. Devar was already awake, as she had expected. He stood by the barn, leaning against the worn wooden structure, his figure outlined by the dim light of the lantern hanging nearby. He didn't notice her at first, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the first hints of dawn were beginning to show. Urena hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but something about the quiet strength in his stance, the way he seemed to carry the weight of his own struggles with such grace, drew her forward. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly as she came to stand beside him. He turned, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Mornings are my favorite time," he said. "The world feels new, like anything's possible." She nodded, her heart aching at the simplicity and truth of his words. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment they stood in silence, the cool morning air wrapping around them. Devar's presence was grounding, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. "Urena," he said suddenly, his tone more serious. She turned to him, her pulse quickening at the intensity in his eyes. "Yes?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about you, about us, and I need to ask, Are you planning to stay? The question caught her off guard, though she supposed it shouldn't have. Devar had opened his home to her, had trusted her despite the mystery surrounding her arrival. He deserved an answer, but the truth felt too large, too alien to share. I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling. There are things I can't explain, things about me that would make staying complicated. Devar studied her, his expression unreadable. Complicated doesn't scare me, he said. What scares me is the thought of you leaving without giving me a chance to help. Her breath caught and she looked away, unable to hold his gaze. You don't understand, she said, her voice barely audible. Then help me understand, he urged, stepping closer. Urena, whatever it is you're afraid of, you don't have to face it alone. His words cut through her defences, the walls she had built around herself trembling under the weight of his sincerity. For a moment, she considered telling him everything, the truth about who she was, why she had come, and what she had been sent to do. But fear held her back, the fear of losing the fragile connection they had built. I'll try, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. I'll try to explain, but not yet. Please, just give me time. Devar nodded, his gaze steady. I can do that, he said. Just promise me one thing. Don't shut me out completely. I promise, she whispered, her heart aching with the weight of her unspoken truth. The days that followed were a blur of routine and reflection. Urena threw herself into the work, helping Devar with the crops, tending to the animals, and learning more about the rhythms of life on Earth. The physical labour was exhausting but oddly satisfying, grounding her in a way she hadn't anticipated. But even as she found solace in the simplicity of farm life, the question of her mission loomed ever larger. Her people's survival depended on her success, yet the idea of using Devar for such a purpose felt increasingly unbearable. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon in a blaze of orange and gold, Devar turned to her with a thoughtful expression. Urena, he began, his tone careful, can I ask you something personal? She stiffened, her instincts urging her to deflect, but the earnestness in his eyes stopped her. Of course, she said, though her voice wavered. Do you ever feel out of place here? He asked. Like you're trying to fit into a world that doesn't quite make sense to you? Do you ever feel out of place here? He asked. Like you're trying to fit into a world that doesn't quite make sense to you? Her breath caught, the question cutting far closer to the truth than he could have known. Why do you ask? She countered, her voice cautious. He shrugged, his gaze drifting to the horizon. I guess it's something I've felt myself, especially after my parents passed. This farm was theirs, and I've always tried to honour their memory by keeping it going. But sometimes I wonder if this life is really mine, or if I'm just holding on to something that doesn't quite fit anymore. His words struck a chord deep within her, resonating with her own struggles. I think everyone feels that way sometimes, she said carefully, like they're searching for a place to belong. Devar nodded, his expression contemplative. Maybe, he said, but with you it feels different, like there's a part of you that's somewhere else. Urena's heart pounded, the truth clawing at the edges of her restraint. She wanted to tell him, to lay bare the secrets that weighed on her, but fear held her back, the fear of losing him, of shattering the fragile trust they had built. I guess we all carry parts of ourselves that we don't share with others, she said finally, her voice tinged with regret. Devar didn't press her, though his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. If you ever want to talk about it, he said, his voice gentle, I'm here. Thank you, she whispered, her heart aching with the weight of her unspoken truth. That night, as Urena lay in bed, her thoughts churned with turmoil. She had come to Earth with a purpose, a mission that had defined her existence. But now she found herself questioning everything. The morality of her task, the depth of her feelings for Devar, and the possibility of a life beyond duty. Her communicator, hidden beneath the loose floorboard in her room, pulsed faintly with an incoming message. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the panel. Finally, she activated it, the soft glow illuminating her face. "Status report," came the voice of her superior, sharp and commanding. Urena swallowed hard, her throat dry. "No progress yet," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Time is running out," the voice warned. "Your people depend on you. Do not forget your purpose." The connection ended abruptly, leaving her alone in the darkness. Urena clenched her fists, the weight of her responsibilities threatening to crush her. But as she closed her eyes, images of Devar filled her mind. His laughter, his kindness, the way he looked at her, as if she were more than just a mission. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to reconcile her duty with the growing warmth in her heart. The dawn would bring new challenges, new choices. But for now, she let herself dream of a world where she could be both Urena of Zerth and the woman who had found solace and love on a simple earth farm. The following day dawned with a golden sunrise spilling over the fields, casting long shadows and painting the farm in hues of warm light. Urena stood by the window, gazing out at the quiet beauty of the earth morning. She knew her time was running out, and the weight of the decision she had to make pressed heavily on her chest. Her people's survival depended on her, yet the life she had found with Devar had opened a new world of possibilities, a life she hadn't known she could want. She couldn't delay anymore. Today she would tell him the truth and accept whatever came next. Devar was already working by the barn when she found him, the rhythmic sound of his hammer echoing in the air as he repaired a section of the fence. She watched him for a moment, taking in his broad shoulders, the sweat glistening on his brow, and the quiet determination in his movements. "Devar," she called softly. He turned, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Good morning, Urena," he said, setting the hammer down. "You're up early. Everything okay?" She nodded, though her heart raced. "There's something I need to talk to you about." The seriousness in her tone wiped the smile from his face. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. "Let's sit." They walked to the porch and settled into the chairs, the quiet hum of nature filling the silence between them. Urena clasped her hands tightly in her lap, searching for the right words. "Devar," she began, her voice trembling, "I haven't been completely honest with you." He tilted his head slightly, his brow furrowing in concern. "What do you mean?" I'm not from here," she said, gesturing vaguely at their surroundings. "I'm not from Earth." Devar's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Not from Earth?" he repeated. "I'm an alien," she said, the words feeling surreal even as she spoke them. "I was sent here on a mission, to find someone strong and healthy to help my people survive. Our planet is dying, and my kind is on the brink of extinction." Devar stared at her, his lips parted slightly as he tried to process what she had said. "An alien," he echoed, his voice faint. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't want to deceive you. I thought I could carry out my mission and leave, but you changed everything. You made me feel something I never thought I could, and now I don't know what to do." The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Urena's chest tightened, the fear of his rejection almost too much to bear. Finally, Devar spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Urena, look at me." She lifted her gaze, her heart pounding. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "This is a lot to take in." But I know this. You're still you. The person who's been here helping me, sharing meals, and laughing with me. Whatever planet you come from, it doesn't change what you've become to me." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she let out a shaky breath. "You mean that?" He reached for her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "I do," he said, "but you have to be honest with me from now on. No more secrets." "I promise," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Devar gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "So, what happens now?" "Are you still planning to leave?" "I don't know," she admitted. "If I leave, my people might survive, but staying feels like the only choice that's right for me." Devar nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Then let's figure it out together. You don't have to decide everything today." In the days that followed, Urena felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The truth had been set free, and Devar's acceptance gave her a sense of hope she hadn't thought possible. They worked side by side on the farm, their bond deepening with every shared task, every quiet conversation under the stars. But Urena's mission loomed in the back of her mind, a reminder of the responsibility she couldn't ignore. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Devar surprised her by saying, "I've been thinking about your people." She turned to him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What if there's a way to help them without you having to go back?" he suggested. Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Well, you said your mission was to find someone strong and healthy, right? Maybe that someone could be me." Her breath caught. "Devar, you don't know what you're offering. The process isn't simple, it's risky, and it could change your life forever." He reached for her hand, his expression resolute. "Urena, I care about you. If this is what it takes to give you peace and help your people, I'm willing to try." Tears welled in her eyes, and she leaned into him, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and gratitude. "You have no idea what this means to me," she whispered. In the weeks that followed, they worked together to prepare for the process, blending Urena's advanced alien knowledge with the resources they had on Earth. The bond between them grew stronger, their shared purpose forging a connection that transcended words. When the day finally came, Urena's spacecraft hummed to life in the hidden clearing where she had landed months ago. Devar stood by her side, his hand tightly gripping hers. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside her. He nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "As ready as I'll ever be." The process was intense, a merging of their essences that left them both breathless and changed. But when it was over, Urena felt a spark of hope unlike anything she had ever known. Weeks later, as they stood together in the fields, Urena placed a hand on her stomach, her heart swelling with emotion. "It worked," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Devar wrapped his arms around her, his smile radiant. "Then it's not just about saving your people anymore," he said. "It's about building a future, our future." As they watched the sunset over the horizon, Urena felt a sense of peace she had never known. Her mission had brought her to Earth, but love had given her a reason to stay. And together they would face whatever came next, united by the bond they had forged and the hope they carried for the life they were creating.